Well, hello everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Working Musicians. As usual, I'm your host, Dris Organica. Today I'm going to be talking about pick versus fingers. A question that was recently asked to me by a very amateur, very close-minded, moronic fellow musician. I'd like to thank St. Arnold for coming out with their Reserve number 16 Divine, which I am currently sampling multiple times. And now I'm behind the mic. And to make things extra special for my St. Arnold Divine Reserve number 16 episode, since this is also the 10th episode of Working Musicians Podcast, I decided to make this a little bit extra special. Today, you might notice that I sound a little bit different. Perhaps a little better, perhaps a little different, because I'm using a different microphone. All the previous episodes, I've used my old faithful Audix i5. In this episode, I'm using... You got this ready? You ready for this? The Lawton Audio Atlantis FC-387 multi-voicing FET condenser microphone. The only reason I know that is I happen to have the operating manual out on my mixing board. I was like, thank goodness it's there. I was about to call it something completely wrong, but I figured this would be interesting. Here I've got it, and I haven't really had a chance to really use this thing too much, and it's just one of those things. You know, sometimes you got to try something different, liven things up, but I've got this thing set on cardioid setting using it's got 3 different voicings. What is it? This is one called. Oh, come on. I've got it on G, which means groovy. It's on the groovy setting, which from what I can tell is a little bit of a darker sound, kind of more so mimics kind of a tube. I'm not saying it's exactly tube, because there's no actual tube in this microphone as far as I know, but it's a little bit darker. If you've ever used a tube microphone, that tends to be a little bit more in the range of what a tube mic sounds. So I'm using the G setting because we are in G mode. G unit! All right, so pick versus fingers. All right, good grief. I hate to take it back down to high school level, but, you know, recently somebody asked me, you know, whether I use a pick or fingers when I'm playing bass. And every time I hear this said, it seems like there's that bass player out there that wants to act like if you use a pick, that you're just an amateur and that you don't know what you're doing. And I'm just thinking, good grief. You know, asking whether somebody uses a pick or their fingers and then getting indignant about their response is a lot like asking, well, do you use a spoon or a fork? And I think we all know the answer is, well, it depends. If I'm eating chicken soup, I'll probably use a spoon. But you know what? If I'm eating chicken, I'll probably use a fork. And maybe even a knife to cut the chicken first, right? But this is something that people don't always get. Like, you know, there's different styles of playing instruments, and that's okay. You know, when I play a bass, I tend to use my fingers on some things, and I tend to use a pick on others. Yet when I'm playing guitar, I tend to use a pick for certain things and fingers for other things. You know, and personally, I'm more of a what I call a hybrid picker. I use both of them. Whoa, what a concept. You mean you use your fingers and a pick at the same time? Well, that just can't be, mister. You have to use one or the other, and you have to decide. This is Chevy or Ford here. Either your pick or your fingers, but there's no in-between. You got to be one or the other, but there can't be an in-between. You can't use your pick and a fingers. Why, it's unjust. It's unjust. Right? Well, if you ever hear anyone ask you that question or say that and act like they're better because they use their fingers for something, realize they probably use their fingers and in particular their thumb for other things, like sticking up their bum, because that's just such a silly thing. And sorry, this episode's going to be stupid. I've had a lot to drink, and I'm a little bit agitated with somebody for asking me such a stupid question, then just getting on my ass. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Jesus Christ of bass. I realize you've been playing for a year and a half. Oh, and that you know everything, but I've been playing for, going on 2 decades now. And I've forgotten more than you've ever learned on your stupid instrument, you dumb fuck. But it's not, as soon as I get out of my attitude and get out of my temper tantrum, I begin to realize, you know what? There's a lot to this question, and I think that we've all been guilty of thinking that, oh, we're superior because we're finger bass players, but guys, we've got to get over this. There is nothing wrong with using a pick on a bass guitar. In fact, it makes a lot more sense on certain genres and styles of music than using fingers. Like, I'll be the first one to tell you, yeah, good luck following along with a guitar player who's playing extremely fast death metal while using your fingers. I'm not saying you can't do it, but there is no way you're going to hit those super fast triplets with any level of precision or attack like you would on a pick, right? So, I mean, that's an obvious example, but for this episode, it's not just about pick or fingers. It's about realizing that there is such a thing as different styles of playing a bass or a guitar, and that there's not really just a one-size-fits-all for all genres and forms of music, and that we have to be adaptable and realize that our instrument is only as good as we are, and you have to know what makes the most sense for what you're trying to accomplish on your instrument. So I figured I'd just go ahead and kind of just roll through my head. I have really no form or rhyme or reason for what I'm going to be saying here, so this is just an entertainment episode. If you learn something, cool. If you agree with what I'm saying, cool. If you disagree, that's fine. But maybe it'll help you think a little bit more about your attitude on playing your instrument, and hopefully will help, people who maybe aren't quite as experienced as myself, or people who are as experienced or more experienced to kind of reaffirm what they already believe. But I'm really hoping that people who, maybe haven't been playing as long as I have or other people have can really kind of open their mind to the reality and just kind of get over just this stupid, big-headed, ego that goes behind playing an instrument. And I've noticed that in particular, bass players seem to be really, really juvenile about this question, pick or fingers. And in reality, well, yeah, sure, that makes sense, but let's go a little bit further than just, do you use a pick or do you use your fingers, right? Let's go on a little bit further and just say, hey, what kind of styles of playing are there, and what do you need to use between a pick and your fingers to accomplish those? And go in a little bit more depth into how you actually hold the pick, how you hold the instrument, and kind of go from there. So, at any rate, I apologize if I come across as a little bit inebriated and a little bit agitated, because, my word, I just got bombarded by a couple of teenagers who just have no idea what they're talking about. As one of them was bashing the other one because the other one plays bass with a pick. And I was just like, oh my goodness. And of course, the one that says that they are a strictly finger player used me as example. Oh, well, Dris only uses, on his music, he plays with his fingers. I'm like, well, sure, on these particular songs, but I was so just not in the mood to argue with a 17-year-old kid that I just kind of let it go and let them talk and just kind of stop paying attention to them. But you could say, what am I doing talking to 17-year-olds? Well, sometimes that's just how things work out. I know people who have 17, 15, 16-year-old kids, and so as it just so happens, if I'm around them, there's a good chance I might come into contact with their offspring. Frickin' delinquents, right, who think they know everything. But that's just the millennials. That's just kind of how it is. Just like, people of my generation tend to be a little narcissistic. well, these kids tend to think that they know everything and are just they're very privileged and that everything is owed to them. So here you go, buddy. I'm going to owe you an explanation on reality. And hopefully some of you guys will get a kick out of what I'm saying here. And I don't know. We'll see what happens. Okay, so for those of you who are bass players or guitar players who also play bass, or singers who play bass, or people who want to act as if they're musicians and therefore buy a bass and claim to be a bass player, it doesn't matter because the point remains the same. Whether you use a pick or your fingers does not really matter, but understand that they are different. One isn't necessarily better than the other. They're just different. So while it's kind of hard to imagine that I have to explain this, but apparently it's not like I have to. I mean, nobody really gives a fuck what I say anyhow. But the point is, people need to understand that there's a reason why some people use a pick, some people use their fingers, and then guess what? There's people who are real, true, professional bass players. Sometimes they use either a pick or their fingers, or sometimes they use both. In fact, I have a buddy who I've been a long-term friends with, and let me tell you something. Shh, keep this a secret. But sometimes within the same song, he uses both a pick and his fingers. Whoa, that's amazing. I didn't know that could be done. Well, why would somebody be such a flip-flopper? You got to be one or the other, right? Well, that's such bullshit. Guys, they just sound different. And there are certain things that tend to sound better on a pick versus fingers. Like if you're using something, if your goal is to play something like punk or metal, it just makes more sense to use a pick in general. Not to say you have to. There's nothing wrong with going the other way around, but they sound different. Something with a pick is a little bit more tingy. It has a little bit more of a transient attack to it. But it's also a little bit less full body. So there's nothing wrong with that. But realize your choice of how you play and percuss an instrument is going to have a difference in interpretation on what the sound's going to be. Now you can say, why are you so agitated with people who are hating on bass players who use a pick when I typically use my fingers when I'm playing bass? That's because the genre of music I'm playing is typically alternative acoustic music. In fact, some of the stuff I play borders along the lines of kind of heavy rock music, even though I use an acoustic. So something to keep in mind is, if your goal is to be a bass player, you need to know how to use both a pick and your fingers because they're different sounds and they lend themselves better to certain things. Like I'll be the first one to tell you, there is definitely something to be said about using your fingers and having a warmer, punchier sound, right? But I'm telling you, there's a lot of times where if you're playing something fast, it just is so much cleaner and easier to listen to when somebody uses a pick, right? And there's times when it just makes sense to use one or the other in different circumstances. And so, I mean, I don't want to beat this to death, but I think people have a tendency to think that if you prefer one playing style over the other, that you have to stick to it. That's just complete crap. I mean, I'll be the first one to tell you, I am primarily a pick acoustic guitar player. Yet, at the same time, it blows people's mind when they see me play an acoustic guitar, and even though I'm holding a pick, they'll see me use my other 3 fingers that aren't holding a pick to hit other strings on a guitar, and it just blows their mind. It's like they never thought that you could use both a pick and your fingers at the same time. And in the back of my mind, I'm just thinking, how have y'all ever gone this far playing without realizing this? I mean, there are so many times where it just makes more sense where like you've got 2 strings in the middle of a 6 string chord you're playing where the 2 strings are mute, but the other 4 or 5, the other 4 or so strings that you're playing, how do you do that without, using both your pick and fingers? And obviously you just kind of hover your fingers over those strings so that they kind of mute themselves. But it's not the same. There are certain times where you need to learn how to do this. I mean, anybody who plays jazz or anything to that, or blues, realizes that you've got to be able to use both. I think it's called Travis picking, but I just kind of know it as hybrid picking. And it's kind of a like, hey, do whatever seems to make the most sense and whatever sounds best. And, well, I don't mean to get off on the tangent of acoustic, but let's bring it back to bass. Guys, realize that even though it looks cool in some ways and it seems cool to say like, hey, I play bass with my fingers. That's great. Good luck trying to play death metal with your fingers. I'm not saying there aren't people who can do it. If you're Victor Wooten, you can do anything. But at the same time, Victor Wooten can play any bass kind of instrument however he wants. In fact, he could probably play the bass with his dick and it would sound better than, anything I or you would do. But that's not the point. The point is realizing that it's not about what you do, it's why you do, right? So if you're going to use a pick or your fingers on a bass application, you need to make sure that you're doing what's right for the source and the music, and to just leave your godforsaken ego out of this. I can't tell you how many times I've run into this, even where it's people I'm either recording or working with, and they just insist on playing something with their fingers. And it's like, why are you doing this? It sounds worse. Here you've got this big chorus pedal you're using on the bass, and you're using your fingers, and it's just muddy and it sounds bad. Why, if that's the case, turn off the chorus pedal, If you're purposely trying to make your bass sound like it's got glass strings, get those fingers out of your ass and get them around a pick and use it, I just think musicians really lose grip with reality on what's the most important. And it's about what sounds best for the material you're playing. And once again, not to hark on bass players, because I realize it's one of those things where bass is a very underappreciated instrument. But I'm telling you, there is a whole world of difference between a guitar player who plays bass and a bass player. A bass player, a truly professional bass player, you don't have to tell them this stuff. They don't have this ego about them where they feel like they have to play these super fast runs or look super cool when they're playing. I tell you, this buddy of mine really has it figured out. I've seen him play live shows with so many different bands, and he's kind of like a hired gun. It's like, hey, we've got a show coming up, our bass player can't make it, or we just need, hey, we got a bunch of money to play some cover shows. I need a bass player for these next 5 gigs. They'll hire him in at a pretty, sound rate. And he just comes in there, and you know what he does? He plays the bass. And let me tell you something. On his guitar, he's got this little like sticky thing where he can keep like 3 or 4 picks, right? And then when you see him playing, he usually has a pick in his mouth, and he also has one on the body of his bass, and he usually has one kind of, in his belt loop, because he realizes there are times and songs where you need to use a pick for it to make sense. And then there's times he realizes it's not important. Now, he might go through 20 picks and not know where they wound up at the end of the show, but never does he ever sound bad. And I see this guy going from pick to fingers all the time. And you know what? He's not out there showboating, although the guy can. The guy can play a pretty killer slap bass, in which case he uses his fingers, right? But then you see him playing something, kind of pop and quick time, and he's back to using the pick. And you know what? This guy looks badass playing the bass. He sounds badass. Nobody ever asks or questions whether this guy is a professional or can really play his instrument, because, he's not showing off. He's just doing what his instrument was designed to do for that song. And it sounds great, right? And half the time what he's playing is just the simplest thing on the planet. But because he knows what his instrument's role is within a song, he knows when it's the right time to play out, to play back. He knows when to play ahead of the beat. He knows when to play behind the beat. And he knows when it's time to use a pick and when it's time to use his fingers, right? So I think that's something that really affects bass players more so than anyone, because, like I said before, it's an underappreciated instrument, and people have this tendency to feel like, okay, if you're a bass player, you have to kind of like have that Napoleon syndrome, for that short man syndrome. You have to be able to kind of show off, and you got to look real cool playing with your fingers and do all this super quick, fast tap and, triple fingering things on the bass. And it's just not necessary. You will always look cooler and sound better by playing what's appropriate. So I'm going to leave the bass players alone because, hey, I get it. I'm not primarily a bass player, but I've worked with enough of them, and I know they don't get the kind of respect they deserve for their instrument because it's quote-unquote easy. But I'll be the first one to tell you, nothing ruins a track quicker than a bad bass player, and nothing breathes more life into a track than a good bass player. It is just amazing how much of a difference it can be had when it's you got somebody like me who's more so of a guitar player playing a bass to a track versus a truly professional bass player. While there's something to be said about having the guitar player play the bass parts because they can be a little bit tighter on a recording, outside of that, for some reason, a guy or gal who just plays bass and that is their job, that is their goal, and that is their role, they just are able to add a little bit of something that others just can't. Because a bass is not about technicality or playing fast. It's one of those things where like it's not just the note you play, it's how you play it, where your string is in relation to the fret, how you move your strings up and down the fretboard. And it really is amazing how a professional bass player can make a very seemingly simple bass line just sound like magic on a track because they understand what the purpose of a bass instrument is to music, right? So, I'm going to kind of cut off from there because at some point I'm sure I'll probably touch on bass a little bit more, but I want to bring this over to the pick versus fingers argument and move it on to the guitar realm. All right, I had to take another sip of that Reserve number 16. I always buy the St. Arnold Divine beers every time they come out, because I work at a retail location where I manage, and so of course every time there's some kind of a new release, I always have them hold a case for me if they know it's good for them. And usually with the St. Arnold Divines, I'll buy a whole case of it and just sample it. Every month I'll have a beer, but this one, the St. Arnold Divine Reserve number 16, I'm not sure whether I really like it or really hate it. It tastes like, I can definitely tell it's like a barley wine of some kind, or I don't know, I could be wrong, but it tastes kind of like beer with motor oil fermented in like a whiskey barrel or something. It's just really bizarre. I mean, it's great. It's unique, but, and I'm able to drink several of these. I've already gone through like 3 or 4 of them over the last 2 hours, but it's just weird how something that's just that fine of a product and just that unique, it's hard to wrap your mind around it. Which kind of brings me to the subject of fingers versus picks on guitars. Oops, I just said it backwards. It should be picks versus fingers if I were to follow the episode headline correctly. Definitely tastes barley, motor oil, and barrel. That's definitely a different beer. All right, so when it comes to using your pick versus your fingers on a guitar, I think the big one that comes to mind here is acoustic/classical guitars. While a classical guitar would typically have nylon strings instead of the steel ones, in addition to the nickel strings, usually it's got 3 nylon, 3 nickel. Whereas a typical acoustic guitar will have 2 steel guitar strings, and the bottom 4 will be nickel wound or something like that. I could be saying it wrong, but anyone who's looked at a classical versus an acoustic guitar realizes that, hey, the strings are a little bit different. In fact, they're way different. And another thing is that usually the difference between an acoustic and a classical guitar, aside from the string choices, is that the strings are a little bit further apart from each other on a classical guitar because they were designed primarily to be used with finger picking, right? Now, most people don't play classical guitars. That's fine. And as much as I love listening to classical guitars, while looking at a fire in my fireplace and just relaxing with a nice Saint Arnold Divine or something to that extent. Uh, there is something to be that needs to be understood about playing with your fingers, especially on an acoustic guitar. It is not a precise art form. You'll notice that if you listen to most classical guitar players, it's obvious that they're not playing with a metronome. The classical guitar style is really more so something that you can kind of play by itself. It's kind of like being able to play piano, It's basically the guitar's version of a piano. It's not intended to really fit to a grid. Not to say that you can't play it in addition to a drum set and a full band setup, because clearly you can. It's done quite common. But if you look at classical guitar music as a genre and really get into it, you'll notice it's very seldomly recorded to a click, because that's the kind of genre that's all based on feel. It's not really based on the typical song format. It's just a different kind of genre. So something to be understood about when you're playing with your fingers, especially on a classical guitar, is that the timing is not as precise. It's just not going to be, because unless you're just truly amazing, most people are not quite as able to fine tune their finger playing to be as in time as they can with a pick. However, that does not mean that you should use a pick for every application with an acoustic guitar or a classical guitar, right? But, with the exception of, typical mainstream classical guitar music with the nylon strings and, the kind of cheesiness where it's very nice and melodic, but, it's not the kind of thing you want to drive to work to while listening, because you'll probably fall asleep and crash into a ditch, right? There's some music I just can't listen to because while I'm driving, because, it's actually a safety concern. And I would say classical guitar music is one of those. Hey, it's great while trying to relax, but I would not recommend listening to that while you're driving. It could be the last thing you do, literally. Yet, you move it over to the acoustic guitar with the steel, E and, actually, no, I can't remember. Does an acoustic, let me look at my acoustic guitar. I can't remember. This is pretty ridiculous. Okay. Yeah, I thought so. So on an electric guitar, the high three strings are a different, they're like a steel string, and the bottom three are like nickel wound. But on acoustic guitar, the lower four are nickel wound or bronze or whatever it is, but wound. And then the top two strings, I guess it's the E and the B string, or I can't even think. But the highest two strings are like just, glossy steel string, right? And so, not to say that you can't play it primarily with your fingers, but it's one of those things where if you do it for a long period of time, your fingers bleed. It's just uncomfortable, and it just doesn't really make sense. If that's your goal, go get yourself a classical guitar. Yet there's a lot of people who do primarily play using their fingers on a steel string, an acoustic guitar, but it's a different style you play. So, something to think about when you're playing an acoustic guitar, and whether you're deciding, should I use my fingers or a pick on this part? I had a similar instance where I'd actually wrote a song while I was just kind of like leaning back, relaxing in my studio chair, playing my acoustic guitar. I couldn't find my pick because my son comes in here and I don't know what he does with my picks, but I play for whatever reason, like he always steals my Dunlop gray picks, and I can never find them. So half the time I'm like, all right, I'm ready to play guitar, and I can't find the picks. So I'm just like, okay, I'll just fart around with my fingers. While I'm more so a pick player, I'd say I'm like 80% pick, 20% finger player, even though I'm more of a hybrid picker, where I use, even if I'm using a pick, I only use two fingers on it, which I'll get to later, and use my other three fingers for the potential for finger picking. But I'm like, okay, so I'm just writing a song. It ended up being a train song, which I referenced to in, I think, episode 3 or 4. Something about building on the backs of giants or songwriting. Yeah, I think the episode was called Episode 3, Songwriting and Giants. But believe it or not, in that particular pre-production track that I shared with y'all, I ended up using a pick while I was playing that. Yet I wrote the song while playing it with my fingers, right? So if you ask yourself, okay, Dris, so if you wrote that song while finger picking, why did you use a pick to record it? Well, very simple. It sounded better using a pick. Bottom line. I mean, when you use your fingers on acoustic guitar, it's a much more rounded and dull sound. Not to say, or maybe dull's not the right word, more of a melancholy sound, more of a round, kind of a thump sort of a sound versus a ting kind of a sound, and when you're thinking of a train, because I still haven't finished the track. I mean, it's funny, I've probably got 20 something 30 tracks that are just in the pre-production phase that I've never gotten around to actually recording. So kind of wonder, why is it that you talk about pre-production so much, but you only have so many tracks recorded? Well, I'll get that to another episode, I'm sure, because you got to, it's one thing to do pre-production, and that takes a lot of time. But when you actually get around to tracking stuff officially, it's just another ballgame. And at the stage I'm in my life with, young kids, there's not a quiet room in the house to be able to do this, and I just don't have time. But eventually, I've got 3 albums worth of material that I can record whenever my heart so desires to. But the question I ask here is, okay, so if you wrote the song while finger picking, why is it that you decided to use a pick on the pre-production? Simple. I recorded it using my fingers, and it didn't sound very good. Then I recorded it using a pick, and it sounded way better. I guess it makes sense, because you think of a train as being a very percussive, kind of a sharp, transient kind of a sound, and it just sounded better, having those, stark, strong attacks, kind of thinner sounds. It just made more sense for that track, right? And that's the point I'm trying to get to. You need to do what sounds best for the material you're playing, and just get out of this headspace that, if you use a pick, it's because you're not very good. That's BS. Anybody who hears me play, acoustic music realizes that I've got the ability to do some things with a pick that most people can't. You know what I mean? While there are people who play a finger acoustic guitar way better, because I'm so competent with a pick, and other people like me are so competent with a pick, we can actually play what they do. I mean, give or take, and we might have to change things a tad, like something I like to play a lot of is a John Denver. Yet he tends to use this, he's more of a finger pick player, and I'm not. I use a hybrid technique, and at this point, I'm not really interested in trying to invent the wheel. I'm just going to sort of do what I do, and the style that I play physically, and adapt that to be able to play the song. So sure, I might play it a tad different, or it might sound a tad different, and that's okay. But when I play my John Denver stuff, I use hybrid picking, where I'm using a pick and my fingers all at the same time, and I'm able to play it. So that's one of those things I think people need to understand, is that, you need to be able to understand both, but more importantly is not devoting yourself to one camp, but being open to the fact that you need to be more, if you want to be well-rounded, you need to be somewhere in the middle. And if you want to devote yourself to being the world's best finger player or pick player, that's fine. But realize that you are pretty much putting yourself in a camp to where you will not be able to do certain styles of music worth of crap. Good luck being primarily a finger, bass player and trying to do death metal or super fast punk. I'm not saying you can't do it, that people who are extremely, extremely talented and just, uncommon, not to say they can't do it, but next thing it may not sound better than the guy who's nowhere near as talented, just because he decided to use a pick, and that's what he does. Certain styles lend themselves to different styles of playing, or certain genres lend themselves better to different styles of playing. So That's really it in a nutshell. But something I've kind of noticed is that people who pretty much only do one or the other tend to only pick or finger pick because they have bad technique, right? And what do I mean by bad technique? Well, believe it or not, there is a correct form to holding a pick, when you're playing guitar or a bass. And granted, if you're playing bass, you might use a little bit different density of a pick or material. If you use a real hard pick, it sounds a little bit different and reacts a little bit different. I tend to use a Gin Dunlop 0.88 millimeter or whatever it is. And it works well for what I do, but there are certain times if I want something that's real bright and clean where I need to use something a little bit harder or possibly a little bit thicker, or if I'm using something that's just mostly for like texture and I just want to catch like the transients of me strumming a chord, I might use a real thin pick, and that's okay. It's just different tools to do different jobs. But what I've noticed is that most people's picking technique is just awful, whether they use their fingers or a pick, but generally if somebody, I've noticed this so many times where like you see somebody playing a guitar and it's just obvious that they're going to have to play certain styles of music because they have not developed their right hand picking, so to speak. It's not to exclude you lefties, you know what I mean? But just for example, since probably 90% of us are right-handed, your right hand is your picking hand. And I've noticed that a lot of people are so far behind because they never really learned how to use the proper technique and pick holding style, which doesn't seem like should be that big of a deal, but it is. You should only be holding your pick with your thumb and your index finger. That's it. That's all you need to hold the pick. And if you're using more than that, more than likely you need to go back to basics and relearn how you hold a pick. Now there are things to be said about, hey, if you're strumming, you do it one way. If your finger pick, if you're going up and down syncopating, while using a pick, you might hold it a tad bit differently in relation to where you move your thumb and index finger in relationship to the pick. Or if you're sweeping, I tend to notice that I'm not an especially good sweeper. I mean, I can get around, I can kind of do it. In fact, the whole reason I stopped playing electric guitar is because I started, what's his name? Herman Lee from Dragon Force released some videos on how to sweep pick and play some of their songs. And after about 2 weeks of trying to learn how to sweep pick, I politely set down my guitar, my electric guitar, stopped playing guitar for about 6 months. Or it probably wasn't that long. It was probably about a month or two, because I was so frustrated that I knew if I picked up a guitar and tried to do that again, I was going to smash it. So my hat is off to anybody who learns how to sweep pick or do that kind of thing, because that is just a lesson in muscle memory and takes so much practice that I have no patience and to be able to try to learn that anymore. I have no desire to even attempt to do that, because I got to respect the guys who have the patience to learn that kind of stuff, because Lord knows I sure don't. I tell you, I was about to go break some shit in my house because I was so pissed off at going up and down an arpeggio trying to sweep and just I'd kind of get it and then kind of not, kind of get it, kind of not. And after, weeks and weeks of practicing, I got better, but it's still, I realized I'm going to be doing this for 6 months just to kind of get it. So to those of you who have put in the effort, my hat's off to you, but you're crazy. You're crazy. I could not imagine doing that many times in an attempt to learn something that is just so hard to listen to. But hey, to each their own. I respect it, So the point is, if you're doing something like that, you'll need to hold your pick a little bit differently, and that's okay. But I see a lot of guys, it seems like they use all their fingers or 4 fingers or 3-4 fingers just to be able to hold the pick. And it's no wonder that they can't play an acoustic guitar worth of crap, when it comes to anything other than just strumming chords up and down. So when I say, when it comes to, should you use your pick versus fingers, if you have to ask yourself that question because you're trying to, you know, look better or trying to pretend like you're more professional than you really are, you know, if you have to ask yourself whether you use your pick versus fingers for something, because it's more than likely because you can't play it one way or the other. And if you can't play it one way or the other, it's probably because you have the wrong technique. And when it comes to finger technique, I'm just going to be the first one to tell you, anything goes. There is no right or wrong way to use your fingers to play an acoustic or electric bass instrument. Just whatever works. But I'll tell you, yeah, if you think you're going to play fast, syncopated, triplet or very quick, bass lines using your fingers, obviously it can be done. Hey, I can kind of get away with it, but I tell you, it's sloppy. Just be prepared and be expected to know that you're going to have to practice the hell out of this, and that you're going to have to, set up your bass to where it's made to be able to do this kind of thing. Or you can just be like a normal professional person and use a pick, right? So the point of all this is just, guys, realize that if you have to ask yourself, or if you're saying, oh, well, if you use a pick, it's because you don't know what you're doing, you're completely wrong. If you use your fingers over a pick over applications where it makes way more sense to use a pick, it's probably because you don't have very good pick holding technique and you need to revisit the basics. And you'll begin to notice that oftentimes it makes a whole lot more sense to use one versus the other. Now, while I personally use mostly do finger style bass for some of the music I do, be realistic. It's because of the style of music I'm doing. If I were doing metal, I would probably use a pick. If I was doing punk, I would probably use a pick. It just depends on what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with using one or the other. It doesn't mean one's easier or one's harder. They're just different. And if you want to be a well-rounded musician, you need to learn both, and heaven forbid you be able to kind of mix and match when you need. Because guess what? There is nothing wrong with putting the pick in your mouth as you use your fingers, and then when it comes back to the chorus, you grab that pick back out of your mouth and start playing like a true professional bass player would, or like a guitar player who realizes that there are certain parts where if they're doing finger picking, it might be more appropriate for a soft kind of a melancholy verse. But when it comes to that power chord chorus, it's time to bust the pick out, right? So I'm just going to stop there because I think I'm kind of going off on a tangent. But guys, it's just sometimes I hear people say things and it's just so aggravating because, hey, I was in high school too at one point where people had these kind of arguments as to, oh, well, if you use your fingers then over a pick, you're better. Or if you use a pick because you can't use your fingers. And no, if you use one over the other because you can't do the other, it's because you can't do the other. And that's fine. But just realize that one isn't necessarily better than the other. They're just different. They produce different sounds and they have different pros and cons. So if you do one over the other, realize that's because you haven't practiced the other. And if you haven't practiced the other, you're behind the curve and you're not a very well-rounded musician. And that's fine. But it doesn't make you better, more professional, or more elite than the other. It just means you haven't gone to the other side. And once you kind of begin to learn both sides, you begin to realize the pros and cons of both of them. And I think what most professional, musicians do that have been playing for, a decade or so have begun to realize is that, hey, sometimes you have to mix and match and do whatever sounds right. There might be whole songs where you never touch the pick. There might be whole songs where you never use your fingers. And then sometimes there's times where you use both. Alrighty, guys. Well, thanks for putting up with me for my 10th episode. It's been a pleasure as always. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye.